Immediately following the release of the finale of The Chosen Season 2, I sat in this very same room and gave you my initial predictions for The Chosen Season 3. Over a year has passed since then, 14 months to be exact, and now that The Chosen Season 3 official trailer has premiered, I think it's time to revisit my former predictions and see how accurate I was, and maybe to refine my predictions for Season 3, so that's what we're going to do today. And in order to do that, we're going to have to see the return of my handy-dandy Excel spreadsheet. So if this is your first time here to Now Let's Be Honest, and if this is your first time seeing the Excel spreadsheet here, let me explain to you a little bit about what this is right here. This is actually my personal gospel harmony, and if you don't know what a gospel harmony is, basically this is what people do whenever they take the gospel texts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they try to compile them together into one uniform narrative, because that's kind of one of the difficult things whenever it comes to understanding the chronology of the life of Christ, is that we have 4 different accounts that aren't entirely focused on telling things from a chronological perspective. And so there's a bunch of different people who have made different gospel harmonies. This is just one that I have created myself over the course of years of research, and this is just kind of where I land when it comes to the chronology of the life of Christ. And so this is my personal one, and I have been using this over the course of the past few years to guide my predictions for where The Chosen might be heading in future episodes. And so what you can see here is that I have totally nerded out, and I have color-coded all of this, just to kind of figure out where we're kind of landing at. And so you can see just from an overview here, we've got the color code, like basically the color guide up at the top right here, where we've got the 2 Christmas specials, the Shepherd and the Messengers, and those are both represented by the burnt orange on here. And then we have all the things from Season 1 showing up in green, all the things from Season 2 showing up in gold, and all the things in Season 3 are in blue. And so what we're going to do as we go through this is we are going to primarily be focusing on the things that we're going to be seeing in Season 3, and we're going to be looking at the things I predicted over a year ago. We're going to see how accurate that is based off of what we've seen in the trailer so far, and then what we're going to do is we're going to be kind of making changes as we go based off things that were revealed in the trailer, and that's basically how this is going to work. And so, let's do it. All right, so as you can see up here at the top, we mainly have stuff from Season 2 and the Shepherd showing up at the beginning, right? I mean, we have, literally in Season 2, Episode 1, we have John quoting the opening to his gospel, the prologue, right? And so we have John chapter 1, the opening verses there being quoted in Season 2. Then we go down and we have a lot of stuff with the birth of Christ really being dealt with in the Christmas specials, the Shepherd and the Messengers. But as we go further down, we're going to see more stuff coming from Season 1, obviously, because that's where our story kicks off. We have the boy Jesus in the temple. That was a flashback that we saw in Season 1. We have Jesus growing, which was also kind of tied to that flashback in Season 1. We have Christ choosing his first disciples, which was actually something that shows up in Season 2, because this is specifically talking about Philip and Nathanael when Jesus called them in Season 2, Episode 2. But we also have Jesus turning water into wine, Season 1, Episode 5. We have Jesus meeting with Nicodemus, Season 1, Episode 7. We have Jesus going through Samaria, Season 1, Episode 8. The woman at the well, Jesus, Season 1, Episode 8. We're just having all this different stuff here, and one thing that you'll notice is that The Chosen is kind of flexible with their chronology, but also that's because it kind of goes back to the difficulty I already voiced about how we don't really know a set chronology for the life of Christ. This is only a result of my own personal study. People will disagree, and when you're telling a story like The Chosen, how they're trying to do it, you've got to realize that they are primarily telling a story as one cohesive 7-season arc narrative. Whereas whenever the Gospels are telling the life of Christ, a lot of it is more episodic, and each one of the Gospels has a specific message it's trying to communicate, and the order that they place their stories in are primarily focused on communicating that particular message, not necessarily focused on chronologically telling the story, and not necessarily on building up drama the way that a TV show is trying to do, right? Really, with all the Gospels, once you get to the Passion narrative and you actually have the days building up to Christ's death, that's whenever you really have the heightened drama and the suspense building up. But really a lot of the stuff prior to that is more episodic in nature. And so when you're telling a story how the people at the Chosen are trying to do, they're naturally going to be a little bit more flexible with this, right? And so that's why we shouldn't be surprised whenever they're kind of shifting stuff around. And given the fact that we're doing a 7-season arc here, they're very limited in how they can portray certain things, and they might have to take 2 different events, combine them into one event. They might have to just kind of skip over certain events because they have 7 8-episode seasons, right? That is 56 episodes where you're trying to cover all of this stuff. And by and large, and in addition to that, they're also having to create their own narratives to help tie these events together. And so it makes sense that they're going to be playing it a bit loosey-goosey with some of this stuff. But once we get down here, we arrive at some of my very first predictions that I had for season 3. And what I did here is I was kind of just looking at different events that we had. We have the stuff down below, which was all stuff featured early on in season 1. We have Jesus moving to Capernaum, Jesus teaching from a boat, the nets filling with fish, Jesus calling his disciples, specifically Peter, Andrew, James, and John. That was all stuff in season 1. But then if you go back a little bit earlier in the gospel accounts, we have John being imprisoned. This is actually something that seems to have happened prior to Christ really kicking off his ministry. Whereas in The Chosen, they've kind of reserved that for the end of season 2. And so when it came to my initial predictions, I started putting some of these events early on here, right? So I said that probably in season 3, we are going to see Christ healing the nobleman's son and Jesus being rejected at Nazareth. And personally, I'm going to leave these 2 things in here, but you'll notice over here, I have put compared to the healing of the centurion's servant, because we have 2 very similar stories in the Gospel of Accounts where somebody comes to Jesus asking for somebody to be healed, and Jesus heals them from a distance. In one story, it is a nobleman asking for his son to be healed. In another one, we have a centurion asking for his servant to be healed. People will debate about whether or not this is the same story. Maybe the servant was a son, or maybe they're 2 separate stories. I think for the sake of The Chosen, they are going to combine these 2 stories together because the stories are so similar. Whenever you're having to condense this down into one 7-season arc, I don't think they're going to tell the same story twice. And so I think they're going to combine these 2 stories together. And in the official trailer, we do have evidence that this is actually going to be Gaius, the Roman soldier who we have been tracking with for the first 2 seasons. He is in season 3's trailer, and he's sitting next to somebody who is sick. This could be his son, it could be his servant, they could be combining both of those together. I don't fully know, but I think we have evidence that that story is going to take place in this season, and so I get a little check mark there because I believe I was correct. Moving on, I did say that I think that we're going to see Jesus being rejected at Nazareth, and once again, if you have checked out my reaction video and my breakdown videos, both of which are on this channel, I posted them yesterday. If you check those out, you will see that we have good evidence to see that that is going to be taking place in this season as well. Jesus is going to go to Nazareth, he's going to be rejected, and it seems like in the Gospels at least, that was actually the thing that initiated his move to Capernaum. Whereas in The Chosen, once again, they've kind of changed that a little bit to where he actually is in Capernaum already at the very beginning of the season 1, and he actually is just now arriving there. And so we don't really know what led him there according to The Chosen, but in the Gospels it seems like maybe he was rejected, and that ultimately is what caused him to move over to the city that he's currently in. And so I think we're going to see that, and so far for me, I'm 2 for 2 when it comes to predictions. We're going to move down a little bit further. And this is one of those places where, once again, it was pretty easy for me to predict because all of season 2 was building up, or really the back half of season 2 was building up to the Sermon on the Mount. And the season literally ends with Jesus stepping out there, opening up his mouth, beginning to preach the Sermon on the Mount. But the only thing we actually got in season 2 was the Beatitudes. However, we know that we know that they filmed a bunch of Jesus preaching because they had this huge event called the Sermon on the Mount where everybody paid money and they got to come to Midlothian, Texas to film this big event. And so we know that we knew ahead of time that we were going to see a lot of the Sermon on the Mount being put to the screen. And so this was another thing that was pretty easy for me to predict even a year ago whenever I made that video. Because of course we're going to see the Sermon on the Mount. But now that the official trailer's been released, we actually have evidence that that really is going to show up because in the trailer, we have Jesus quoting certain parts of the Sermon on the Mount. We have him saying at the beginning of the trailer, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Well, that comes from the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. Later on, he is quoting the thing about whoever obeys these words of mine and does them, or whoever hears these words of mine and obeys them, he will be like a wise man. Well, that comes from the very end of the Sermon on the Mount. And so we have both the beginning and end of the sermon being represented in here. And I don't know whether or not they are going to quote the whole sermon verbatim in this show. I think that'd be really cool because I would love to just like combine all the different scenes together so that we had one long compilation of Jonathan Rumi performing the Sermon on the Mount. That'd be really cool. I don't know if they're going to do that or not, but this is one of those places where, once again, I'm going to leave this highlighted because we have evidence that that is going to be the case. We are going to see that in season 3. And so I'm 3 for 3 so far. We got the healing of the centurion's servant or the nobleman's son. We got Jesus being rejected at Nazareth, and we've got the Sermon on the Mount. Moving a little bit more forward, this is where I started getting more into the speculation stuff. And really what I did is I just looked at some of the events that we have taking place in the Gospels that have already showed up in season 2. And I just went a little bit further and just guessed that probably that's the direction they're heading for season 3, because it just makes sense. If you just flip to the next stories, that's probably the stuff they're going to try to include. And sure enough, I think that we do have confirmation of some of this stuff in the official trailer. First off, we do have the Pharisees plotting to kill Christ. That is something that I predicted was going to be here. And I'm going to leave it highlighted, but I'm still not sure whether or not we're actually going to see that in this season. But we do know that we're going to see rises in opposition. Even in the trailer, we do see the prominent leader Shammai voicing his desire to destroy the false prophecies arising in the land. And so we're definitely going to see opposition there. Whether it gets so far as them like actually wanting to kill Christ, I guess we'll have to just wait and see. But I'm going to leave that highlighted because I've got a good feeling we might be getting to that point already in this season, which I think would be good. Jesus escapes the Pharisees and heals multitudes. I think we're going to see Jesus evading the Pharisees multiple times in this season, and I think that he's going to be doing a lot of healing. And so I fully expect us to see that stuff as well. Jesus praying and appointing the 12 apostles. I predicted that was going to show up here, mainly because at the end of season 2, all the 12 were there, right? We literally met Judas Iscariot in the final episode of season 2. We had all 12, and since we're only doing a 7-season thing, it just kind of made sense that the 12 apostles had to be appointed in season 3 because they're with Jesus for his whole ministry. And so if we're already 2 seasons into a 7-season arc and Jesus is getting crucified in season 6, we need to have those 12 apostles. And so sure enough, in the trailer, we have Jesus explicitly telling them, I've appointed you my apostles. And so far, my predictions are going pretty good, which I don't think says anything good about me. I think it actually says something more about the Chosen and how faithful they are to Scripture, right? Because I was not doing anything spectacular. I was just going through Scripture and saying where I thought we were going to head. And sure enough, they are being faithful and they're just kind of walking through this. I also have Jesus coming down the mountain and healing the multitude. Once again, this is not in the trailer, but this, like, whether we see this largely depends on how Jesus is going to appoint the apostles in the show. Because in the Bible, what he does is he goes and he prays on a mountain, then he comes down and he chooses the 12, and then he goes and heals people. I don't know if they are going to portray it in the same way in the show. It actually might be something as simple as what we saw in the trailer where Jesus is just sitting in a room with them and he tells them, hey, I've appointed you as my apostles. And so they might do it a little bit differently in the show just because setting up this whole vetting and choosing process and him going up on the mountain and praying, that might take too much time where they might actually need to just kind of speed through that a little bit, because I know very early on in the season they're going to be sending out these guys 2 by 2, and I don't know if they're going to be lingering enough on a moment like that, which really you can kind of just speed through. It is very significant in the Gospels, but when you're trying to tell a story in a show, I don't think you necessarily have to have that, and so I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see this, but for the sake of now, I'm still going to leave it highlighted just because it's very possible. Then we have the other story that I said was very similar to the one mentioned above. This is Jesus healing a centurion's servant, right? And this is, once again, people debate about whether or not this is a different story or the same story as him healing the nobleman's son. For the sake of this video and for the sake of my predictions, I'm going to highlight it because I believe they are going to combine these 2 stories together for the sake of The Chosen, mainly because that makes the most sense when you're not wanting to just repeat the same story multiple times. They're limited on time. I think they're going to have that there. And we have evidence for this one in the trailer, because once again, Gaius is sitting there. We got evidence for it. Next up, we have Jesus raising a widow's son from the dead. And what I'm actually going to do here is, this is the first one where I predicted it was going to happen, but I'm going to remove the color here. And the main reason why is because we have evidence that he is going to be performing a resurrection in this season. And I don't think they're going to have him perform 2 resurrections. It's very possible. There was one part in the official trailer where he does pull a boy close to him and kiss him on the forehead, and there's a woman standing in the background. That could possibly be the widow's son who died. That's possible. I don't know. But I would be surprised if they have 2 resurrection stories in the same season. They do show some of the same miracles occurring because inevitably Jesus does a lot of the same miracles throughout the Gospels. And so in season 1, we did have a paralytic guy being healed. And in season 2, we also had a lame man being healed as well. And I think we're probably going to see another lame man being healed in season 3. So I think that we are going to see repeat miracles. But I would be surprised if they put both resurrection scenes in the same season. I don't know. They might do that. And you know what? If they end up putting him healing the widow's son, I'll just take the L and I will accept it as it is. But for right now, I'm going to remove that prediction just because I think they're going to focus more on him resurrecting Jairus' daughter. And I wouldn't be surprised if they just never included him healing the widow's son. I don't know, though. Like I said, there is that one scene in the trailer which might be that exact scene right there. I just don't know. I'm going to remove it just for the sake of ease. All right. Jesus' fame spreading. I think that we have confirmation of this in the trailer because I think this whole season is really about Jesus' fame spreading, right? He literally ends with a Sermon on the Mount. This season begins with him preaching that sermon, and he just skyrockets to superstardom. John the Baptist is now a prisoner, and so Jesus is going to rise up in his stead, and I think that's just what we're going to see. And I think the trailer just pretty much confirms that. So that's another one where check mark for David. My name is David, by the way, if you don't know who I am. I'm David. Welcome to Now Let's Be Honest. That's who I am. John the Baptist receives word and sends his disciples. We have confirmation of this in the trailer as well. We literally have the disciples of John the Baptist coming to Jesus, and they're saying, are you the one who is to come, or should we look for another? And so once again, I think I was spot on. Go David. Jesus responding to John the Baptist. We have this in the trailer as well. He says, go and tell John what you see. And he doesn't say the words in the trailer, but we get shots of a person about to be resurrected. We have a shot of a blind person. We have a shot of a lame person. And in his response to John the Baptist, Jesus does say, tell John what you hear and see. The dead are raised, the lame walk, the blind can see. And so I think we have evidence that, yeah, Jesus is going to do exactly this. And this one, I'm going to leave this right here. This is where the disciples start talking to Jesus, and they're kind of asking about what John's purpose was. And Jesus explains that he kind of was the Elijah to come, because of, the prophecies in Malachi and stuff like that. And that story immediately follows Jesus' response to John's disciples. And so I imagine that they will just kind of go immediately into that part in the episode, just because it seems like they are going to focus a lot on John the Baptist this season, because it seems like he's in prison and they're going to be building up to him dying maybe in, I'm going to guess, probably episode 7, if not at the beginning of episode 8. I think that it's going to really, it could happen earlier, but I think it's going to be really towards the end of the season. John the Baptist is going to be killed. It's going to shake some people up. And I think that in order to really focus on the John the Baptist stuff, Jesus is going to have to explain people, like, what is John's purpose? Why is he here? Why are you allowing him to be in prison? I think Jesus is going to have to answer a bunch of that, and so I'm going to leave that there. Okay, one thing that I did not predict, but did show up in the trailer, is this thing right here, so I'm going to now turn that blue, because I believe that is a accurate prediction, because like that, I mean, we just have evidence it's going to be there, because this port right here, where he offers a great invitation, this is where Jesus turns and says, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, right? All who labor and are heavy laden, for I will give you rest. And Dallas Jenkins himself has confirmed, I think he made a Facebook post about it literally last night, where he said that this season is all about Jesus giving rest to the heavy laden and to those who labor. And so we're definitely going to see that in here. I did not predict that. I did not know if that was going to be in here, but sure enough, that is going to be in there, because Jesus literally says it in the trailer. And so we got evidence for that. Stuff down here. We might see it, we might not. I'm not going to add anything on here just because I don't feel comfortable enough to predicting it. But the stuff that happens after this, I think, is all fair game, right? Because we have Jesus going to a house in Capernaum. We have Jesus talking about the unforgivable sin. We have the Pharisees asking for a sign and him talking about the sign of Jonah. I wouldn't be surprised if that shows up here because it does seem like this season is really wanting to lay the groundwork for the fact that Jesus is thinking a lot about his crucifixion. And when Jesus talks about the sign of Jonah, he is telling them about, his crucifixion, essentially. He says that just as Jonah was 3 days under the earth, so the Son of Man will be 3 days under the earth. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that's there. I'm just not confident enough to put it in my prediction area, right? I'm not going to highlight it yet, but it might show up there. And then we have Jesus' family coming to see him. We might have evidence for this as well because we know that there's going to be a lot of focus on Jesus and his family in this season because we've already seen scenes where Jesus is hanging out with Mary during a festival and they're just hanging out with one another. They're talking about his brothers, James and Jude. And, or if you come from another faith tradition, you might not think they're his brothers. You might just think that they're family in some other way, stepbrothers, cousins, stuff like that. And so we do have evidence that it's going to focus on his family. I just don't know whether or not we're going to see these specific events. I'm just trying to be as conservative as possible here, and so I'm not going to highlight it. Or how about this? What I'll do, just tentatively, I'll highlight this in a lighter blue, right? It's a light blue just to say maybe it'll show up there. I don't fully know, but we'll highlight it in light blue just for us to say, okay, maybe that was a tentative prediction. I'm not as confident. Jesus forgiving a woman who anoints his feet. I don't think we're going to see that in this season, mainly because this is another story that is very similar to another one that shows up closer towards the end of Christ's ministry. And this is another place where I don't think that the Chosen creators are going to repeat the same story twice. I think that they'll probably just combine them together. And so I would expect us to not see this particular scene in this season. I think they're probably going to save it for maybe the end of season 5 or the beginning of season 6, because season 6 is really focusing on the crucifixion. And so really, I imagine that they might save it for that particular season there. Because to me, I think that's probably the more appropriate place. Kind of like Jesus cleansing the temple, right? Some people debate about whether or not he did it at the beginning of his ministry or at the end of his ministry or both. I think that obviously they have chosen to save that for the end, mainly because when you're trying to tell a compelling, cohesive narrative, it makes sense to save that for the end. There's certain things that it's really fitting to parallel, like you have Jesus causing Simon Peter and them to catch a bunch of fish at the beginning of the ministry. I imagine that they will replicate that entire scene at the end because there's a really important reason why those are repeated in the Gospels. And those are definitely two separate events. Whereas a lot of these other ones, people debate about whether they're two separate events, primarily because there doesn't really seem to be a predominant reason why they are repeated. And so I think because of that reason, I think the creators of The Chosen will just choose to depict those scenes one time. And so I don't think we're going to see this in this season, so I'm going to leave that there. We did see Jesus healing a man at the pool of Bethesda in the last season, but I don't think they're ever gonna cover this stuff right here in the show because that stuff immediately followed that scene, and so they would have to work it back in there in some other way, and I just don't think they're ever really gonna cover it. So I think that that's kind of gone beyond, because really the time to cover these scenes right here would have been right after that scene, and instead we just kind of ended one episode there, and then the next episode picked up at another place, and so I don't think we're gonna see that stuff in the show. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some of these. There's just a bunch of parables from the Gospels that are just kind of right here. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some more of those throughout here because Jesus is going to be teaching a lot. And so I imagine that they'll kind of probably do with these what they've done with the parables in the past, because a lot of these have been referenced in earlier episodes and earlier seasons. And so I think that they'll probably just sprinkle them in here and there, but I just don't have any way of predicting which ones are going to show up. So I'm just not going to predict anything there. Let's see. Other stuff right here, there's more parables, excuses for not following Jesus. I wouldn't be surprised if stuff like this shows up. Jesus calming the storm, I do not think is going to show up in this particular season at all. If they do show it, I hope that they do show it, but I think that they'll probably save it for another season for just to make it a bigger spectacle, a really big moment. But I don't know if they're going to do that or not. I know that they said that they're not going to have Jesus walking on water, which I hope they change their mind about that, because literally it shows up in the like in the song that they sing at the beginning the TV show Walk on the Water. So I really hope that they change their minds there, because you could definitely have Jesus walk on water. We'll see. I hope they change their minds. But okay, one thing that I did not predict would happen, but we do know will happen because of the trailers, is these events right here. Because the trailer depicts all three of these things happening. We have Jesus on his way to heal Jairus' daughter. We have the woman with the discharge of blood touching Jesus' robe, specifically the tassels hanging from his robe. And then thirdly, we have Jesus actually getting ready to heal Jairus' daughter. And so I did not predict this, but I'm going to highlight it blue now because we have confirmation that that is going to show up here, which to me might suggest that we're going to see some of this stuff here because, and this is why, we know that this stuff down here is going to happen, right? We actually have evidence that this stuff is going to happen here. So it seems like when they were writing season 3, they were dealing a lot with this portions of the gospel. And so I think that that means that we are going to see this stuff right here happening. Maybe not all of it. It says that Jesus heals 2 blind men here. I don't know if we've really seen. We have Shula, who's a blind woman, so maybe they could kind of heal her. I don't know. We might not see this here. I don't know, but I think that we are going to see Jesus preaching through cities. He's probably going to be doing that while he sends out the other 12 to go do their thing. He's going to encourage his disciples to evangelize. I'm actually just going to highlight this right here, and I'm also going to highlight a prophet without honor, because this has to do with Jesus once again being rejected in Nazareth, right? And so we have 2 stories of Jesus being rejected in Nazareth in the Gospels. I think this is another place where they're going to just combine them together, and they're going to make it one story, right? Where Jesus is rejected, and then he's also going to talk about how a prophet is without honor in his own hometown. So I think they're going to, boom, combine them together. And so I think we have evidence of that in the trailer. And then we also have Jesus sending out the 12, which they have confirmed is going to happen in this season, and which we see kind of being the groundwork laid in the trailer. And so we know that's going to happen. Like I said, John being beheaded, I can almost guarantee you it's going to happen in this season, just because that's one of those places where the Gospels are fairly clear about the chronology, where John being beheaded is one of the reasons why Jesus goes away to a desolate place, because it seems like he wants to mourn over John the Baptist's death whenever he goes away shortly before the feeding of the 5,000. Really, the primary motivating factors there is that the apostles have returned from going out 2 by 2. John has been beheaded, and just it seems like Jesus is just taking the disciples away so he can mourn over his cousin's death, and so that they can kind of just rest and enjoy time by themselves, discipling one another and stuff like that, just away from everything. So he goes to a desolate place, but then the crowds follow him. And rather than turning them away, Jesus decides to just minister to them despite his own grief, despite the fact that these guys are all tired. And so the Gospels do have a fairly firm chronology there. And so I think that we're going to see John being beheaded in here. So that's something I've predicted, and I think that we're going to see it. I don't know if we're going to be introduced to Herod or not in this season, but there might be a place where he is introduced. There is a Roman guy who people were guessing is Herod Antipas. I don't think that's him in the trailer. And I think it's probably somebody else. Some people also thought it might be Pilate. I don't know, maybe. But this would be the place for him to show up, because he would just be wondering about who Jesus is, but there's not really an interaction between him and Jesus, because him and Jesus really never interact until Jesus is, about to die. And so what I'll do, I'll actually remove my highlight there, because I don't think we're going to see that. We might. But I do think that the baptizer's disciples are going to tell him of his fate. I wouldn't be surprised if it's the same exact disciples who were questioning him earlier, and that might cause them to doubt Jesus. I don't know. But then we are going to see Jesus feeding the 5,000. That is going to happen in this season. We saw that in the trailer. But then this stuff right here, I am actually going to unhighlight. Because at the time I made this prediction, I was expecting the feeding the 5,000 to happen maybe halfway through the season, but now I believe we have confirmation that's going to happen at the end of the season, which means that they're setting up everything for a really awesome opening for season 4. If they follow the chronology. Like I said, they did suggest that they're not going to have Jesus walking on the water. I don't remember where I heard that, but I believe I heard somewhere that they said they're not going to be doing that particular scene. I hope that they do, because that would be a really cool way to begin season 4, because that is an event that happens immediately after the feeding of 5,000. Jesus goes up on a mountain to pray, and then the disciples are going across the stormy sea, and Jesus walks on the water to meet them. And that would just be a really cool way. I mean, can you just imagine it? Opening up season 4. Honestly, you could just have season 4 opening up in the middle of the storm. right? There's just waves crashing, everybody's freaking out, and Jesus like walks out at them. And then, Simon Peter walks out to him. He begins sinking, and then Jesus raises him up, and they take him to, they walk back to the boat. The storm calms, and then it just cuts to the opening credits. Walk on the water. That'd be a really great opening to season 4, if you ask me. I don't know if they're going to do that, but I do not think these things are going to show up in season 3. And I think this would be really cool stuff, because then you have the bread of life discourse, which they better put in there. That is one of my, John chapter 6 is one of my favorite portions of all scripture. And so I really hope that they include that long discourse there. And I think that might be it. Let me scroll down here to see if there's anything else that I need to highlight. Nope, none of that, none of that, none of that, none of that, none of that. This is really long stuff. You can see how much there is for them to cover. Yeah, I don't think they're going to cover any of this stuff in the show here. And so there are my predictions for season 3. And then just to go over here real quick, let's just kind of look at this. I don't really have much to add here, but what we do see here is that as of season 3, we will officially have all 12 disciples. 8 of them were introduced in season 1. We had Simon Peter, who as of now is still just named Simon, but I imagine he might get the name Peter in this season. I don't have that highlighted in my predictions because I'm not totally sure, but I imagine he will get that. So we got Simon Peter, Andrew, James, John, Matthew, Thomas, Little James, and Thaddeus. They were all introduced in season 1. Season 2 saw the introduction of 4 more of them, right? We had Philip and Nathaniel early on, Simon the Zealot about halfway through, and then in the very last episode, we had our introduction to Judas Iscariot. And so the only person who still needs to be called to Jesus is Judas, and in the trailer, we do have confirmation that is going to happen probably in episode 1, where we actually have this introduction where Judas is introducing himself to Jesus as Judas of Kerioth. And so that's one thing that I predicted would happen at the beginning of season 3, and once again, looks like I was correct. As for these flash forwards and flashbacks and stuff, I imagine that we might see another 1 or 2 in this season, but when it comes to what particular stories might benefit having a flashback or anything, I can't think of anything. Maybe when Jesus is getting rejected at Nazareth, they specifically bring up the law of Moses and stuff. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe they include a flashback to the people at Mount Sinai or something, and they are all camped there, and somebody has to be pushed off a cliff, or they have to be killed for blaspheming or something like that. That would be really cool to me, because that would explain what they mean whenever they say they have to apply the law of Moses, because basically they're saying we have to reject you because we think that you're blaspheming against God. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see that. I just don't know. But we do have 3 Old Testament flashbacks in season 1, 1 Old Testament flashback in season 2, and 1 New Testament flash forward in season 2. And so that kind of is a staple of the show. And so, if anything, I imagine that they're going to try to force that in there in some way. But what I am going to do, going back up here to the Judas thing, I'm going to say 3/01, and I am going to say that this is going to be after the Sermon on the Mount, that we're going to have this official calling thing here. Man, I've got to format this real quick. That's going to bother me. Let's change this to Alegria. There you go. And so, yeah, there is my official predictions updated, and as more content from The Chosen comes out, I will definitely update this prediction list for us. Until then, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed this little me nerding out for a little bit, and definitely let me know what other predictions you have for season 3. What other stuff you think might show up in the season that I didn't mention, or maybe you disagree with me. Let me know. I look forward to interacting with you all in the comments. Until then, my name is David Tate. This is Now Let's Be Honest. Be sure to keep a smile on your face. Don't let anybody steal your joy, and I'll see y'all later. Bye.
You read a verse, you sing a hymn, the money's in the plate. Sundays you mark out for him, but even then you show up late. You bought the shirt, you wear the cross, but sin throughout the week. For 30 shekels and a noose, you kiss him on the cheek.